A wet, tearing sound behind the ribs, inaudible to anyone else, was the true agony of the rejection, far sharper than the sting of public humiliation. As Tristan the future Alpha stood before the entire Winter Court and denounced Maeve as unworthy of his bloodline, it felt as though she might hemorrhage right there on the frozen stone. She gathered her meagre belongings, fully anticipating a lonely death, as a nameless rogue only to be stopped at the courtyard gates. The Alpha King. Tristan's father stood in her path, his gaze fixed upon her with a starving intensity. The great hall of Ethelgard smelled of roasted boar, wet wool, and wood smoke. It was the winter solstice, the longest night of the year, and the fortress was packed with roaring drinking wolves. Maeve stood near the hearth, a wooden cup of weak ale warming her cracked hands. She was a healer's assistant, an orphan of a border skirmish, wearing a scratchy, worn-out linen dress. She was nobody, until the clock struck midnight and she turned 20. It didn't happen like the bards sing. There was no golden light, no angelic choir. It hit her like a physical blow to the back of the head. A scent cut through the grease and sweat of the hall's sharp pine ozone and cold steel. It bypassed her nose and dragged her wolf straight to the surface. Her claws elongated, biting into the wood of her cup. Her heart slammed against her sternum, frantic, demanding. Mate! She followed the scent, blindly pushing through the throng of armored bodies. Her breath hitched as the trail led her directly to the high dais. Tristan the Alpha Heir sat lounging in a high-backed oak chair, a cup of wine balanced on his knee. He was beautiful in the harsh, arrogant way of untested royalty. Beside him sat Lady Rosamond, the daughter of a wealthy neighbouring lord, her hand resting intimately on his thigh. Maeve stopped at the base of the dais. She couldn't breathe. Her wolf was whining, scratching at the back of her mind, desperate for him to look down. When he finally did, his expression didn't soften. He inhaled, his nostrils flaring as the bond slammed into him. His eyes flashed wolf amber for a fraction of a second. He knew. And then his lip curled. He looked at her muddy boots, her frayed hem, the soot smudged on her cheek. He looked at Rosamond, clad in crimson velvet and draped in jewels, and he did the math. A dirt-poor healer versus an alliance that would double his army. Tristan set his cup down. The noise in the hall began to die as wolves, sensitive to shifting pheromones, turned their heads toward the dais. The silence spread like a bruise. "Did you need something, girl?" Tristan asked, his voice ringing out across the quiet stone. Maeve swallowed her throat dry as dust. "You know." He stood up, towering over her from the steps. "I know that the moon goddess has a twisted sense of humor, or perhaps it's just a test of my resolve." He didn't lower his voice. He wanted an audience. "I need a Luna who can lead armies, a woman of breeding, of strength, not someone who scrubs blood out of bandages." Maeve's knees felt hollow. "Tristan, don't speak my name." He snapped the command laced with alpha authority that forced her chin down. "Let's be quick about this. I don't want the stench of it ruining the feast." He raised his voice to a booming shout. "I, Tristan of Ethelgard Alpha Heir, reject you, Maeve. I sever the cord. I deny the bond. You are nothing to me." The tearing sound was deafening. It echoed in her skull, a violent snapping of tendons and magic. A gasp ripped out of her, a wretched, ugly sound, and she dropped to her knees on the cold flagstones. It felt like he had reached into her chest, grabbed a handful of her lungs, and ripped them out through her throat. Searing agony radiated down her spine. She threw up a mouthful of bile onto the stones. Whispers broke out across the hall. Pity. Disgust. Mockery. "Get up, Maeve," a gruff voice muttered. The court physician pulled at her shoulder. "Get up before you shame yourself further." She couldn't stand. The physical trauma of a broken bond was catastrophic. Her wolf was howling in the dark, curling into a ball to die. Through the blurred, tearing haze of her vision, she looked past Tristan's sneer. Behind him, seated on the massive throne carved from black ironwood, sat Aemon the Alpha King. He hadn't moved. He wore no crown, only a heavy dark cloak clasped with a silver wolf's head. He was a mountain of a man scarred from decades of brutal territorial wars, his dark hair streaked with iron grey. While Tristan looked like a prince from a tapestry, Aemon looked like a warlord who had burned the tapestry to stay warm. Their eyes met. His were a pale, icy blue. He didn't look at her with pity. He looked at her with an intense, terrifying stillness. He didn't stop his son, and he didn't intervene. He just watched her bleed. She pushed herself up, her hands shaking so violently she could barely lock her elbows. She didn't look at Tristan again. She dragged herself backward, step by stumbling step, away from the warmth and the laughter, and out into the freezing night. Her room was a closet above the apothecary, smelling permanently of dried garlic and camphor. Maeve didn't bother lighting a candle. Her hands were entirely numb as she shoved her few possessions into a canvas sack, a woolen blanket, a spare tunic, and a hunting knife with a chipped handle. Her chest was a hollow, echoing cavern. Every breath felt like inhaling ground glass. A rejected wolf cannot stay in the same territory as their mate. The proximity is a slow, agonizing poison. The wolf eventually claws its way to the surface in a fit of feral madness ending in execution. Her only choice was the borderlands. She would become a rogue. She would probably freeze or starve before the month was out, but it was better than losing her mind. She tied the sack tight and threw it over her shoulder, wincing at the pull on her muscles. The fever was already setting in, the chill of the broken bond seeping into her marrow. She slipped down the wooden stairs, moving quietly through the shadows of the lower ward. The snow was falling heavily now, burying the mud of the courtyard under a sheet of pristine white. The guards at the outer gate would be huddled near their braziers. If she kept to the wall, she could slip through the postern door unnoticed. She was 10 paces from the iron-banded door when a shape detached itself from the gloom of the armory wall. She froze, reaching for a blade she hadn't strapped on. The man didn't step into the moonlight, but he didn't need to. His presence hit her like a physical weight. The air pressure dropped. The ambient noise of the wind and distant drunken singing seemed to die away. It was a suffocating aura of dominance, ancient and heavy. "Running away, little wolf." The voice was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated through the soles of her boots. Aemon. She dropped her chin in immediate submission, shivering violently. "My king," she rasped. Her voice sounded wrecked. "I am leaving the territory, as is the law." He stepped forward, his boots crunching loudly in the fresh snow. Up close, the Alpha King was intimidating in a way that made every instinct scream to go prone. He was a foot taller than her, broad-shouldered and lethal. A jagged scar cut through his beard, tracing up to the corner of his jaw. "The law says a wolf may leave." Aemon corrected his tone, conversational, though there was nothing casual about the way he boxed her in against the stone wall. "It does not say she must." "If I stay, I will go mad," she whispered, keeping her eyes fixed on the silver clasp of his cloak. "Your son." She choked on the words, the ghost pain flaring in her chest. "Your son made sure of that." "Tristan is a fool," Aemon said. The blunt, emotionless way he insulted his own heir made Maeve's head snap up in shock. "He thinks with his pride, not his wolf. He trades a fated bond for a few 100-foot soldiers from a fat lord." Aemon let out a derisive snort. "He will find out soon enough that a broken bond leaves a rot in the blood. That doesn't help me," she said, a spark of cynical anger finally piercing through her grief. She adjusted the strap of her bag. "I'm the one who pays for his choice. Please, Alpha, let me pass." Aemon didn't move. He leaned in just a fraction. And then she smelled it. Earlier in the great hall, Tristan's scent had been a chaotic explosion of pine and ozone. But this was different. It was dark, rich, and overwhelming. Wood smoke, damp earth iron, and old leather. It rolled over her, sinking into her pores. It didn't strike her like a blow. It wrapped around her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Her inner wolf, which had been lying curled up, waiting to die, suddenly lifted her head. She stumbled back until her spine hit the frozen stone wall. "What is that?" She breathed panic rising in her throat. Armand stood over her, his icy blue eyes locked onto hers. "For 15 years my wolf has been silent," he said softly, the low timbre of his voice vibrating against her skin. "Ever since the last queen died, giving birth to my disappointment of a son. I thought the beast was dead. He never cared for politics. He never cared for the concubines I took to warm my bed." Aemon reached out slowly, deliberately. She flinched, but he just caught a strand of her hair that the wind had whipped across her face. His large, calloused fingers brushed against her icy cheek. A jolt of electricity shot through her jaw straight down to her toes. "But tonight," Aemon continued, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr, "when that idiot boy broke the cord, my wolf woke up. He tasted the blood in the water. He smelled you." She shook her head, her mind unable to process it. "No, Tristan was my mate." "Tristan was—" Aemon corrected his thumb, dragging across her lower lip, forcing her to look up at him. "The goddess doesn't let a strong wolf die for the mistakes of a weak one, Maeve. The bond snapped, and it found the nearest anchor. An anchor strong enough to hold you." He stepped flush against her. The heat radiating off him was immense. Her shivering stopped instantly. The tearing pain in her chest dulled, replaced by a deep, pulsing ache of a completely different nature. "You're not leaving Maeve," the Alpha King murmured, lowering his face until his breath brushed her ear. "Drop the bag." She stammered, terrified of him, terrified of the sudden desperate craving her body had for his proximity. "I am a peasant. You are mine!" Aemon growled, the Alpha command woven so deeply into the words that her hand opened on its own accord. The canvas sack hit the snow with a dull thud. He didn't give her time to process, to argue, or to run. Aemon wrapped a massive arm around her waist, hoisting her against his side, as if she weighed nothing, and turned his back on the gates, walking her back toward the towering shadows of the royal keep. Morning came with a brutal, biting cold that frosted the high windows of the king's chambers. Maeve awoke in a bed large enough for 4 swathed in furs, thicker than anything she had ever touched. For a moment she forgot. She stretched, expecting the drafty chill of her attic room. Then the smell of wood smoke and iron hit her, and the events of the night rushed back. She sat up. She was alone in the bed. She was wearing one of Aemon's linen shirts, which swallowed her whole. The agony in her chest was gone entirely, erased, replaced by a strange, humming warmth. She touched her ribs. No pain. The mate bond hadn't just been replaced. It had been overwritten by something monolithic. The heavy oaken door clicked open. Aemon walked in. He was dressed for court black leather steel braces, his wolf head cloak draped over his shoulders. He looked hard, uncompromising, and deeply dangerous. "Get up," he ordered, though his tone wasn't cruel. He tossed a bundle of dark fabric onto the end of the bed. "Dress, we have a pack meeting." She pulled the bundle toward her. It was a gown of deep midnight blue wool, tailored and lined with silver thread, accompanied by a thick fur mantle. "What is this?" "Your armor," Aemon said, simply turning to pour water from a silver pitcher into a basin. "Tristan is holding court this morning to announce his official courtship with Lord Garrick's daughter. He plans to solidify his position." Maeve's stomach turned. "And you want me there? Why, so they can throw scraps at me?" Aemon stopped wiping his face. He turned, leaning his hips against the washstand, staring at her with those glacial eyes. "Do you think I brought you to my bed to hide you in it?" She swallowed hard, clutching the blue wool to her chest. "I don't know what you want with me." Aemon crossed the room in 3 long strides. He knelt on the mattress, caging her in with his arms. His face was inches from hers. "I want a queen," he said softly, yet the words felt heavier than a shouted command. I want a Luna who knows the bottom of the barrel, who knows pain, who doesn't simper when a lord offers her a jewelled cup. I want my mate." He leaned down and pressed his mouth to the crook of her neck. Maeve gasped as his teeth lightly scraped over her scent gland. He wasn't biting to Mark, not yet, but he was bathing her in his scent, layering his dominance over her so thickly that no wolf in 100 miles would mistake who she belonged to. "Dress," he repeated, pulling back his eyes, flashing a vivid, predatory silver. "Don't keep your subjects waiting." An hour later, the great hall was packed, tighter than it had been for the solstice. The mood, however, was vastly different. Morning light poured through the clear story windows, illuminating the spilled wine and half-eaten food from the night before. The pack was hungover, irritable, and murmuring. Tristan stood on the dais, looking smug. Rosamond was beside him, already acting the part of the Luna, looking down her nose at the common wolves. "My father is late," Tristan announced, loudly tapping his sword hilt. "But we need not wait on the old bear. Today we forge a new alliance." The heavy iron doors at the back of the hall slammed open, hitting the stone walls with a crack like a thunderclap. The room fell dead silent. Aemon strode through the doorway. He didn't walk like a man coming to listen. He walked like a predator entering a pen. And Maeve walked right beside him. The blue gown fit perfectly. The heavy fur mantle dragged across the floor. She kept her chin up, her heart hammering against her ribs, terrified but tethered by the solid, unyielding presence of the king at her side. Every head in the hall turned. She saw the court physician gape. She saw the guards stiffen. But it was Tristan's reaction that made her breath catch. Tristan stopped mid-sentence. His eyes darted from his father down to her and then narrowed. He inhaled sharply. The distance was far, but alpha wolves have keen senses. The scent of wood smoke iron and Aemon's deeply possessive musk was rolling off her in waves. Tristan's face drained of colour. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking, losing its carefully practiced alpha resonance. Aemon didn't stop until they reached the base of the dais. He looked up at his son, his expression carved from granite. "You called a gathering to announce an alliance, boy." Aemon said, his voice echoing in the cavernous silence. "I decided it was fitting, as I have an announcement of my own." Tristan gripped the armrest of the high chair. "You brought her here to punish me. The rogue should be gone by now. I rejected her." "You did!" Aemon agreed calmly. He stepped up onto the first tier of the dais, pulling Maeve up with him. "You threw away a gift from the goddess for a political trinket." He glanced at Rosamond, who shrank back from the sheer weight of his gaze. "A foolish mistake, but a fortuitous one for me." Aemon turned to face the hundreds of pack members. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He projected his voice with the effortless authority of a man who had held life and death in his hands for 40 years. For 15 years, Ethelgard has bled without a Luna. I have bled without a mate. He reached out and grabbed Maeve's hand, lacing his thick fingers through hers. The contrast of his scarred skin against her pale hand was stark. The goddess in her infinite wisdom saw fit to correct my son's weakness. Tristan stepped forward, his fists clenched, his wolf pushing against his skin, furious at the territorial infringement. "Father, you cannot be serious. She is a peasant, a dirt scrubber. She is my leftovers." Aemon moved faster than a blink. 1 second he was standing beside her, the next he had Tristan by the throat, hoisting the golden-haired prince off the floor of the dais. Tristan choked, his hands clawing at Aemon's iron grip, his legs kicking in the air. Rosamond screamed. Aemon didn't look angry. He looked entirely indifferent, which was far more terrifying. "You will address her as my queen?" Aemon growled, his voice dropping an octave, vibrating with lethal intent. "Or you will address her as Luna. If you refer to my mate with anything less than absolute reverence again, I will tear out your throat and give the airship to my favorite hunting hound. Do you understand me, boy?" Tristan turned purple, choking, nodding frantically. Aemon dropped him. Tristan collapsed to the stone floor, gasping and coughing, scrambling backward on his hands and knees. The Alpha King turned back to Maeve, the lethal coldness in his eyes melting away as he looked at her face. He took her hand again, lifting it, and kissed her knuckles in front of the entire, terrified, breathless court. "Kneel," Aemon commanded the room. It wasn't a request. The wave of alpha power hit the crowd like a physical blow. One by one, from the highest-ranking lords to the kitchen boys, the pack dropped to their knees. Hundreds of heads bowed. Tristan, still coughing on the floor, looked up at Maeve. His eyes were wide with shock, humiliation, and a sudden sickening realization of what he had truly thrown away. Maeve looked down at the boy who had broken her chest open the night before, and for the first time in her life, she felt the cold, hard mantle of power settle over her shoulders. The transition from a nameless peasant to the Luna of Erthelgard did not happen with a wave of a wand. It happened in the freezing, suffocating air of the war room. Aemon did not coddle her. The morning after her public elevation, he had a guard escort her down to the lower keeps, where the High Lords and battle commanders sat around a massive map-strewn table. They stopped talking the moment she crossed the threshold. The silence wasn't born of respect. It was thick with skepticism layered over the heavy scent of unwashed armor and stale tobacco. Tristan was absent, nursing his bruised throat and shattered pride. But Lord Garrick Rosamond's father sat near the king's right hand. Garrick was a man carved from suet and cruelty, his fingers glittering with rings bought by overtaxing his border villages. Aemon sat at the head of the table. He didn't stand when Maeve entered. He simply pulled out the heavy ironwood chair to his left. "Sit," he commanded. She sat. The leather was cold. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. "We are discussing the winter stores." Aemon said, his icy gaze sweeping over the gathered lords. "Garrick claims his eastern grain shipments will be delayed until the spring thaw. He suggests cutting the lower ward's rations by half to compensate." Garrick offered a thin, patronizing smile. "It is a matter of survival, my king. The standing army must be fed. The fighting wolves burn hotter, need more meat. The peasants in the lower ward do not patrol the borders. They can survive on less." "They'll starve," Maeve said. The words slipped out before she could stop them. The room went dead silent again. Garrick's smile vanished, replaced by a sneer. "Forgive me, Luna." Garrick dragged the title out, wiping his boots on it. "But the logistics of keeping a pack alive through a blizzard are perhaps more complex than rolling bandages." Maeve looked down at the parchments scattered near her elbow. They were inventory lists. She recognized the horrible, cramped handwriting of the quartermaster. She pulled the ledger toward her. Her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs, but the memory of the freezing attic room steadied her hands. "You allocate 3 pounds of salted venison a week for a foot soldier," she said, tracing the ink with a scarred finger. "But you only allocate 1 pound of oats for a family of 4 in the lower ward." She pulled a piece of charcoal from the center of the table and began to scratch out a crude table on the back of a blank parchment. Quarter population current weekly allocation proposed ration, Garrick mortality risk. Upper keep 803 pounds, meat 2 pounds, grain 3 pounds, meat 2 pounds, grain low. Lower ward 2 401 pound grain 0.5 pounds, root veg 0.5 pounds, grain 0.25 pounds, root veg. Critical. She slid the parchment toward the center of the table. "You don't understand the lower ward, Lord Garrick. The women hauling firewood burn just as many calories as your men walking the parapets. If you halve their grain, they will weaken. When they weaken, the winter fever spreads. It will start in the slums, but it won't stay there. It will crawl up into the barracks. You'll lose a third of your fighting force to sickness before the first snowdrop blooms." She looked up, meeting Garrick's furious glare. "You want to feed your army, cut the wine shipments to the high tables, trade the luxury furs for dried fish from the river clans. If you starve the foundation of this, keep the walls will collapse." Garrick slammed his fist on the table. "I will not be lectured on logistics by a—" "Silence. Aemon's voice didn't rise in volume, but the raw alpha command in it dropped the temperature in the room by 10 degrees. Every lord at the table stiffened, averting their eyes. Aemon slowly turned his head to look at Maeve. His expression was unreadable. For a long, terrifying second she thought she had overstepped. She had embarrassed a high lord in front of the king. She prepared for the reprimand. Instead, Aemon reached out his massive, scarred hand covering hers on the table. The heat of his palm sank straight to her bones. "The Queen has spoken," Aemon said softly, his pale blue eyes fixed on Garrick like a sniper's crosshairs. "Send a rider to the river clans today. The lower ward rations remain untouched. And Garrick—" The portly lord swallowed hard. "Yes, Alpha. If your grain shipments do not arrive by the winter solstice, I will take the difference out of your personal larders. Dismissed." As the lords hastily gathered their cloaks and practically fled the room, Aemon remained seated. When the heavy iron doors clicked shut, leaving them alone, he finally let out a low, rumbled chuckle. It was a dark, gravelly sound that vibrated in his chest. "You are a vicious little thing when backed into a corner," he murmured. Maeve exhaled a shaky breath, slumping slightly in the chair. He was going to kill hundreds of people just to save his own coin. Aemon stood pulling her up by the hand and backing her against the edge of the heavy table. He caged her in his hands, resting on the wood on either side of her hips. "He is a politician. They only see numbers. You see the blood." Aemon leaned in, burying his face in her hair, taking a deep, ragged breath of her scent. "I knew my wolf was right about you. Aemon!" She whispered the name, feeling foreign and dangerous on her tongue. "Tristan won't let this go, and Garrick. Let them scheme." Aemon rumbled against her neck, his lips brushing her skin. "A king does not fear the whispers of mice, and they have no idea what you are truly worth." Winter deepened. The snow piled high against the stone walls of Ethelgard, locking them in a world of blinding white and charcoal grey. And as the cold set in, the rot began to show. Maeve saw Tristan 3 weeks later in the main courtyard. She was carrying a basket of dried willow bark and feverfew to the healing wards, accompanied by 2 massive, silent guards Aemon had assigned as her shadows. Tristan was sparring with a wooden practice sword. He looked terrible. The golden boy of the winter court was pale, his skin sporting a sickly, waxy sheen. Dark circles hung under his eyes like bruises. He swung his sword clumsily, his footing sloppy in the packed snow. His sparring partner, a young lieutenant named Cailan, easily parried the blow and knocked Tristan to the dirt. Tristan stayed down for a moment, chest heaving, coughing violently into his gloved hand. Maeve stopped. She didn't want to care. He had thrown her away like garbage. But the healer in her recognized the symptoms of a body turning on itself. The severed bond. When a mate bond is rejected, the one who initiates the severing rarely escapes unscathed. They think their alpha blood or sheer willpower will protect them. They are wrong. The soul is a violent accountant, and it always balances the books. Tristan looked up and saw her watching. A flash of pure, undiluted hatred twisted his aristocratic features. He scrambled to his feet, ignoring Cailan's offered hand, and stomped toward her. Her guards immediately stepped forward, their hands dropping to their sword hilts. "Hold," Maeve told the guards quietly. They stopped but remained tense, radiating menace. Tristan stopped a few feet away. He smelled like sour sweat and rotting leaves, the scent of a dying wolf. Enjoying the view, Maeve. He spat, his voice raspy. "You look ill, Tristan," she said, keeping her voice perfectly level. "Your body is rejecting the separation. You need white willow and moonbloom tea steeped for 3 hours. It will ease the tremors. I don't need your peasant weeds," he shouted, stepping forward. Her guards instantly drew their blades an inch from their scabbards, the swing of steel loud in the crisp air. Tristan froze, his eyes darting to the armed men. He laughed, a bitter, hollow sound. "Look at you, playing the Grand Queen, hiding behind my father's skirts. I am standing right here, she said calmly. You are the one who threw away your armor. He doesn't love you, Tristan hissed, leaning forward, his eyes fever-bright. You know that, don't you? He's a warlord, a monster. He hasn't felt a human emotion in 2 decades. He only claimed you to spite me, to put me in my place. When he tires of you, he'll discard you just like I did. A cold wind whipped through the courtyard, stinging Maeve's cheeks. She looked at the boy she thought she was supposed to die for. He looked so small now, so fragile. If Aemon is a monster, she said softly, then I am safe in his den, because the monsters outside are far too weak to breach the gates. She didn't wait for his response. She pulled her fur cloak tighter and walked past him, leaving him coughing in the snow. But Tristan's words were a tiny, poisoned needle that slid under her ribs. He only claimed you to spite me. That night, Aemon found her on the high balcony of their chambers. She was bundled in furs, staring out over the jagged peaks of the mountains, watching the moon rise. It was nearly full. Aemon came up behind her. He didn't say a word. He just wrapped his arms around her, pulling her back, flush against his broad chest, trapping the heat between them. He buried his face in her neck, inhaling deeply. You're shivering, he grumbled. And your mind is racing. I can feel it. Tristan confronted me today, she said quietly. She felt Aemon's muscles turn to stone. A low growl vibrated in his throat. I will have his tongue removed. No, she said quickly, resting her hands over his thick forearms. He's already dying, Aemon. The severed bond is poisoning him. He can barely hold a sword. Good. Let him rot. Aemon's voice was devoid of pity. A weak alpha gets his pack killed. Better he dies slowly now than leads us into a slaughter later. He said you only claimed me to punish him. She whispered the words, tasting like ash. Aemon went completely still. Then he turned her around. He didn't do it gently. He gripped her shoulders, forcing her to look up into his face. The silver light of the moon illuminated the harsh lines of his scar, the deep exhaustion around his eyes. Listen to me. Aemon said, his voice a low, rough scrape. I have fought in 12 wars. I have buried a mate, 3 brothers, and countless friends. I do not play games with my life, and I do not play games with my wolf. When I looked at you in that hall, bleeding out on the stones— He stopped, closing his eyes for a fraction of a second. When he opened them, the icy blue was gone, replaced by the pure, glowing silver of his wolf. I didn't see my son's reject, he breathed, pressing his forehead against hers. I saw the only thing in this frozen wasteland worth keeping warm. You are my anchor, Maeve. Mine. The needle of doubt dissolved, washed away by the sheer, overwhelming truth radiating from his bond. She reached up her small hands, framing his rough, bearded face. Tomorrow is the full moon, she whispered. I know. He replied, his eyes dropping to her mouth. Mark me, she demanded. Aemon let out a ragged breath, his hand sliding down to grip her hips. If I mark you, Maeve, there is no undoing it. You will carry my scent into the grave. You will be tied to a scarred old killer until the goddess takes us. Good, she said, pulling his mouth down to hers. I prefer killers to cowards. The full moon in Ethelgard is not a gentle thing. It is a time of feral madness of wolves shedding their human skins and tearing through the pine forests in a frenzy of blood and snow. But the king and his Luna do not run with the pack. The royal chambers were sealed. A massive fire roared in the hearth, casting flickering orange shadows across the stone walls. The air was thick, suffocatingly heavy with pheromones. Maeve's skin was flushed, feverish. The wolf inside her was clawing at the cage of her ribs, desperate, howling for the completion of the bond. Aemon stood across the room, shirtless, the firelight dancing over a torso mapped with a lifetime of brutal violence. Jagged lines of white tissue crisscrossed his chest and abdomen, souvenirs of rogue claws, silver blades and old betrayals. He was magnificent, terrifying, and completely hers. He watched her with silver eyes, his chest heaving, fighting the instinct to just rush forward and take. He was giving her the space to come to him. She let her silk robe slide off her shoulders. It pooled on the floor at her feet. Armin groaned a sound that was less human and more beast, and crossed the room in a blur. He didn't throw her to the bed. He caught her by the waist, lifting her completely off the floor. She wrapped her legs around his hips, her hands tangling in his dark, iron-streaked hair. He crashed his mouth against hers. There was nothing gentle about it. It was a collision of teeth and desperate heat, acclaiming that tasted of blood and smoke. She tore at his back, her nails elongating into claws, leaving shallow scratches down his spine. He didn't flinch. He encouraged it, his hands gripping her thighs tight enough to bruise. He carried her to the massive, fur-covered bed and dropped her into the center of it, following her down instantly. The weight of him was a blanket she wanted to drown under. "Maeve!" He growled against her jaw, his breathing ragged. His fangs were fully descended, scraping lightly against the sensitive skin of her neck. Every nerve in her body was screaming. "Do it!" She gasped, arching her back, exposing the juncture of her neck and shoulder. "Claim me." Armin rose above her on his forearms. The silver of his eyes was blinding. He looked at her, not as a peasant, not as a broken thing, but as an equal, as a goddess. Then he buried his face in her neck and bit down. The pain was a white-hot flash of lightning. Maeve screamed her back, bowing off the mattress, her hands gripping his shoulders so hard her claws drew blood. But the pain only lasted a second. It was immediately followed by a rush of pure liquid fire flooding her veins. It wasn't like the severing. The severing had been a violent amputation. This was a grafting. She felt his soul slam into hers. She felt his exhaustion, his ancient grief, his ruthless determination, and beneath it all a fiercely protective love that burned hotter than the sun. He flooded her senses. She belonged to him. He belonged to her. Armin pulled back slowly, his fangs stained with a drop of her blood. He licked it away reverently, sealing the wound with his tongue. The bite mark, a perfect crescent of punctures, throbbed with magic. "Mine!" he whispered, collapsing against her, burying his face in her chest as she held him stroking his hair, while the storm of their mating broke over them. Miles away in the dark, drafting halls of Lord Garrick's estate, there was no fire and there was no warmth. Tristan sat huddled in a high-backed chair, wrapped in blankets, shivering uncontrollably despite the heavy furs. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken. Beside him stood Lord Garrick, staring down at a map of Ethelgard. He marked her, Tristan rasped, clutching his chest. He had felt the echo of it. The final absolute severing of his residual connection to Maeve. She was utterly gone. He actually marked the street rat. Garrick poured a cup of dark wine and handed it to the trembling prince. "Your father has lost his mind to lust, Tristan. He elevates a peasant, insults his lords, and alienates his allies. He is weak." "He doesn't look weak," Tristan muttered, bitterly, coughing into a rag. It came away spotted with blood. "A tree rots from the inside out." Garrick sneered, pointing a fat finger at the map. "The river clans are isolated. The Western Guard is loyal to my coin. Your father thinks a strong bite makes a strong king. We will show him otherwise." Tristan looked at the map, his eyes narrowing, fueled by sickness, jealousy, and a desperate need for revenge. "When we wait for the deep winter," Garrick said, a cruel smile stretching across his face. "When the snows are too high for reinforcements from the capital, we take the fortress, we take the throne, and we will see how long his little queen survives when she is thrown to the wolves." January brought a cold that didn't just freeze the water in the basins, it froze the marrow in the bones. The snowbanks against the outer walls of Ethelgard reached the parapets. The world was reduced to white wind and grey stone. But inside the lower ward the fires burned hot. Maeve stood in the centre of the muddy, snow-packed square, wrapped in her heavy blue cloak. The air smelled of wood smoke roasting root vegetables and wet fur. The extra rations had arrived just before the passes closed, bartered from the river clans exactly as Aemon had commanded. Because of that, the children running between the stone hovels had meat on their bones. The elderly weren't succumbing to the hacking winter coughs. "Luna!" She turned. A woman with flour dusting her apron bowed awkwardly, holding out a steaming wrapped bundle. "Fresh bread, first of the morning batch. For you and the king." Maeve took it to the heat, seeping beautifully through her leather gloves. "Thank you, Martha. How is your husband's leg?" "Healing, Luna. The willow bark you sent took the swelling right down." She looked at Maeve, her eyes dropping to the snow in deference, but there was no fear in her posture, only fierce, unyielding loyalty. Maeve was no longer the orphan who scrubbed blood from the floors. She was the anchor of Ethelgard. She walked the lower wards every day. She didn't hide in the High Keep. She bled with them, worked with them, and in return the lower pack had stopped calling her the Peasant Queen in their whispers. They called her the Iron Luna. She walked back toward the upper keep, the bread tucked under her arm. The peace of the morning, however, felt brittle, like ice over a fast-moving river. Aemon was waiting for her in the war room. He didn't look up from the maps spread across the table when she entered, but the tension in his shoulders immediately uncoiled. The mate bond hummed between them, a constant thrumming wire of warmth that kept the brutal winter at bay. "You're out late," Aemon grumbled, tracing a scarred finger along a mountain pass on the map. "I was securing our breakfast," she said, tossing the warm bread onto the table. She walked up behind him, wrapping her arms around his waist and resting her chin on his broad back. "What has you grinding your teeth?" He covered her hands with his. "Silence." "Silence is good. Silence from allies is good," Aemon corrected, turning his head slightly. "Silence from enemies is a drawn bowstring. Garrick hasn't sent a raven in 3 weeks. His quarter in the eastern wing of the fortress has been entirely locked down. His men don't drink in the Great Hall. They don't patrol the outer walls." "He's isolating," she murmured. "He's preparing," Aemon corrected flatly. "And Tristan is with him." The mention of his son's name made the temperature in the room drop. Armen rarely spoke of Tristan anymore. When he did, it was with the detached coldness of a commander discussing a tactical error. "Kaelin reported that Tristan collapsed in the courtyard yesterday," Aemon continued. "He couldn't stand on his own. The severed bond is eating his organs. He has days, maybe a week, before his heart gives out." Maeve closed her eyes. The cynic in her wanted to say good. The girl who had knelt on the stones of the Great Hall vomiting from the pain of rejection wanted him to suffer. But the Luna felt the weight of it. A dying wolf is a desperate wolf. "Garrick won't wait for him to die," she said softly. "If Tristan dies, Garrick loses his puppet. He loses his claim to the throne." Aemon turned around, pulling her flush against him. His eyes were hard, calculating. "Exactly. If Garrick is going to strike, he will do it while Tristan still has a pulse to legitimize the coup." A heavy knock echoed on the iron door. Kaelin, the young lieutenant, pushed it open. His face was pale, his breath pluming in the cold air of the corridor. "My king." Kaelin gasped. "The eastern gates." "What of them?" Aemon barked. "The portcullis has been raised. The winches are jammed. Garrick's men slaughtered the gate guards. We have a massive force marching up the mountain path. Mercenaries, rogues, hundreds of them." Aemon didn't flinch. He didn't curse. He simply reached for the heavy broadsword resting against the table. "They intend to take the keep before the sun sets," Aemon said, strapping the sword to his back. He looked down at Maeve. The alpha command in his eyes was absolute. "Go to the deep vaults. Take the women, the children, and the elders from the lower ward. Lock the iron doors from the inside. Do not open them for anyone but me." "Armen." "Do it, Maeve!" His voice was a physical weight pushing her toward the door. "They want my head. They want your blood. I will not fight with one eye looking over my shoulder." He grabbed the back of her neck, pulling her in for a brutal, searing kiss. It tasted of adrenaline and finality. "I will come for you when the snow is red," he whispered. Then he turned a warlord, stepping back into the blood and the ash, and walked out to meet the slaughter. The attack didn't sound like a battle from a bard's tale. It sounded like an abattoir. Screams echoed off the stone walls, mixed with the sickening crunch of breaking bone and the metallic clash of steel. The stench of blood and voided bowels drifted down into the lower levels of the keep. Maeve didn't go to the vaults. Aemon had given her an order to hide, but the Luna does not cower while her pack is butchered. She ran to the healing wards. It was already chaos. Men were being dragged in with missing limbs, deep claw marks tearing through their armor. The few remaining healers were overwhelmed hands slick with blood, shouting for water and bandages. She threw off her blue cloak. She rolled up the sleeves of her linen dress and grabbed a basket of packed snow and needle and thread. "Hold him down!" She shouted to two uninjured soldiers, pointing at a man whose stomach had been laid open by a rogue's claws. For the next 2 hours she existed in a haze of copper and agony. She stitched flesh. She packed wounds with snow to slow the bleeding. She poured biting alcohol over exposed bone, ignoring the curses of the dying. The roaring above them grew louder. The ceiling shook as massive bodies slammed against the stone floors of the great hall, directly over their heads. Then the heavy oak doors of the healing ward splintered and caved in. Screams erupted from the wounded as 5 men stepped through the rubble. They weren't Aemon's soldiers. They wore the grey and silver livery of Lord Garrick. Mercenaries. Their swords were dripping. Well, well. The lead mercenary sneered his eyes, scanning the room of broken men and terrified healers. His gaze locked onto Maeve, standing over a wounded soldier with a bloody needle in her hand. He noted the heavy silver ring on her finger, the scent of the Alpha King radiating from her skin. Lord Garrick said the little whore queen might be playing nursemaid. The soldiers on the cots tried to rise to defend her, but they were too broken. The mercenary stepped forward, raising his sword. "Garrick wants your head in a sack. Says it'll break the king's spirit." Maeve didn't back away. She dropped the needle and picked up a heavy iron surgical cleaver from the tray beside her. She was terrified. Her hands shook so badly the metal rattled, but she planted her boots in the blood-slicked stone. "Come and take it!" she snarled. The man laughed and lunged. He never made it halfway across the room. A shadow detached itself from the hallway outside. It moved with unnatural, terrifying speed. A massive paw the size of a dinner plate wrapped around the mercenary's head. Claws the length of daggers sank into his skull. With a sickening crunch, the beast slammed the man face first into the stone wall. The wall cracked. The man went limp. The remaining 4 mercenaries froze their eyes wide with absolute terror. Standing in the doorway was a monster. It was a wolf, but it defied the laws of nature. It stood nearly 5 feet at the shoulder. Its fur was pitch black, streaked with iron grey, entirely matted with gore. A jagged white scar ran across its snout, mirroring the one on Aemon's human face. Its eyes were glowing, terrifying silver. Aemon's wolf had come. A low, vibrating growl started in the beast's chest, shaking the vials on the wooden shelves. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise of a slow, excruciating death. The mercenaries broke. They turned to run. Aemon hit them like a battering ram. He tore through them with savage, feral efficiency. He didn't use weapons. He used teeth and claws, ripping throats, snapping spines. The violence was so raw, so completely devoid of human restraint, that even the hardened soldiers in the ward shrank back. In seconds it was over. 5 bodies lay in pieces on the floor. Aemon stood amidst the carnage, his massive chest heaving, his jaws dripping red. He turned slowly, his silver eyes locking on to Maeve. For a terrifying second the beast was fully in control. The feral bloodlust rolled off him in suffocating waves. Maeve dropped the iron cleaver. It clattered loudly on the floor. She didn't run. She stepped over the bodies, She walked right up to the monstrous blood-soaked wolf. She reached out with her bare, bloody hands and buried her fingers in the thick fur at the base of his neck. The bond flared brilliantly in her chest, a grounding wire in the dark. "I'm here," she whispered, resting her forehead against his massive, blood-stained snout. "I'm right here." The silver in his eyes flickered. The monstrous tension in his muscles collapsed. The great wolf let out a long, shuddering exhale, a sound of profound exhaustion, and leaned his heavy head against her chest, nuzzling her neck. He was checking her scent, making sure she was unharmed. Before he could shift back, a slow, agonizing clapping echoed from the ruined doorway. They both turned. Tristan stood there. He was a walking corpse. His skin was grey, stretched tight over his cheekbones. His eyes were bloodshot, sinking deep into his skull. He leaned heavily on a longsword, just to remain upright. He was wearing his princely armor, but it hung loosely on his wasted frame. "Beautiful," Tristan rasped, coughing up a spatter of dark blood onto the stone. "The beast and his bitch!" Aemon stepped in front of Maeve, planting his massive paws firmly on the floor. A low, warning growl rumbled in his throat. "Call him off, Maeve." Tristan wheezed, his eyes burning with fevered madness. "Or I'll put a silver bolt through his eye. Garrick's archers are right behind me." He was lying. Maeve could smell it. There were no archers. Garrick had abandoned him, sending him down here as a distraction, while he tried to flee or secure the upper keep. "Garrick is gone, Tristan," she said, stepping out slightly from behind Aemon's massive bulk. "You're dying. Drop the sword. I am the Alpha Heir." Tristan shrieked, the sudden volume tearing at his ruined throat. "This keep is mine. You are mine. You were supposed to be mine." The delusion was total. The severed bond had finally rotted his mind. Tristan raised the sword with trembling arms. He let out a pathetic, broken battle cry and lunged towards them. Aemon didn't even attack. He simply swatted with his massive paw. The blow hit Tristan's sword, shattering the brittle steel and sending the prince flying backward. Tristan hit the stone floor hard. He didn't get up. He lay on his back, staring up at the vaulted ceiling. His chest hitched. A terrible, wet, rattling sound came from his lungs. Maeve walked over to him, signaling Aemon to stay back. Tristan's eyes rolled toward her. The hatred was gone, replaced by a hollow, gaping terror. The alpha arrogance had bled out, leaving only a frightened, dying boy. "It's cold," Tristan whispered, his hand twitching on the stone. "Maeve, it's so cold." He was reaching for her, reaching for the bond he had violently severed, trying to find warmth in the very thing he had thrown away. Maeve looked down at him. She felt no triumph. She felt no joy in his suffering. She just felt a profound, heavy pity. The violent accountant of the soul had come to collect. She didn't take his hand. She just watched as the light faded from his eyes. Tristan took one last, shuddering breath and went still. The siege broke with the dawn. With Tristan dead, Garrick's claim to the throne evaporated. The mercenaries, realizing they were fighting for a ghost and facing the unleashed fury of the Alpha King, threw down their weapons and surrendered. Garrick didn't make it to the Eastern Pass. Aemon's loyalists caught him trying to slip through the postern gate with a saddlebag full of gold. By noon, the fighting had stopped. The fortress of Ethelgard was severely damaged. Black smoke plumed from the eastern wing. The snow in the courtyards was stained a deep, horrifying crimson. Bodies were being stacked onto pyres. But the fortress held. Maeve stood on the high balcony overlooking the main courtyard. She was washed her hair braided, wearing a fresh gown of heavy black wool. The air was crisp, the sky a piercing, cloudless blue. The storm had finally broken. Below, Aemon stood on the executioner's block. He was back in his human skin, though he looked just as lethal. He wore no shirt bandages wrapping his ribs where a silver blade had grazed him. Lord Garrick was forced to his knees in the blood-stained snow. He was weeping, begging for mercy, offering all his lands, his gold, and his daughters. Aemon didn't listen. You brought rogues into my home. Aemon's voice carried across the silent courtyard, reaching every surviving member of the pack. You slaughtered my guards. You tried to murder your queen. The penalty for treason is not a fine. It is the void. Aemon drew his heavy broadsword. It gleamed in the winter sun. For Ethelgard. Aemon roared and swung the blade. It was a clean strike. Garrick's head hit the snow. A profound, heavy silence fell over the keep. The pack watched their king lower the bloody sword. Then, as one, the thousands of wolves gathered in the courtyard dropped to their knees in absolute, unquestioning submission. Aemon turned. He didn't look at his bowing subjects. He looked up, his eyes finding Maeve on the high balcony. Even from this distance, she could feel the intense, burning heat of his gaze. The silver flashed in his eyes, a silent promise. He handed the bloody sword to a guard and began the long walk up the stone stairs to their chambers. Maeve waited for him by the hearth. The fire had burned down to glowing embers. When the heavy oak door clicked shut behind him, Aemon leaned against it for a moment, closing his eyes. The warlord posture melted away, leaving only a deeply exhausted man. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around his waist. He let out a long breath, burying his face in the crook of her neck, inhaling the scent of her skin, grounding himself in the reality that they were both still breathing. "It's over," she whispered, stroking the hair at the nape of his neck. "The snow is red," Aemon murmured against her collarbone. "As I promised. And the rot is gone," she said, pulling back slightly to look into his face. She traced the line of his scar with her thumb. "Tristan is dead. Garrick is dead. The pack is yours." "The pack is ours." Aemon corrected his voice, a low, rough rumble. He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "They saw you in the ward, Maeve. They saw you standing between their wounded and a sword. They do not bow to you because I command them to anymore. They bow to you because you are their Luna." He picked her up, carrying her effortlessly towards the massive fur-covered bed. His body was battered, bruised, and scarred, but his strength was absolute. "I thought I was dead 15 years ago," Aemon whispered, laying her down among the furs and following her down his weight, pinning her comfortably to the mattress. He looked down at her with a reverence that made her chest ache. "I was a ghost haunting a throne. You dragged me back to the land of the living little wolf." She reached up, pulling his mouth down to hers. "I'm not going anywhere, my king." The winter raged outside the stone walls, but inside the fire burned bright. They were battered. They were scarred. They had walked through the blood and the ash to find each other. But as his mouth claimed hers, erasing the cold and the past, she knew one thing for certain. The bond was perfect. And Ethelgard would never be cold again. If you felt the chill of the winter court and the heat of the Alpha King's claim, don't let the story end here. The bond of a true mate is undeniable, and so is our community. Hit that like button if you believe Maeve got the justice and the king she deserved. Share this video with your fellow romance and fantasy lovers who crave a story with real bite. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another epic, pulse-pounding werewolf tale. What was your favorite moment? Let us know in the comments below.